that.
Hey, this is all about money, man. And I got money.
How's Havers?
How you doing?
Hey, Steve.
How are you doing?
How you doing? Good to see you.
Good morning, everybody. It's time to get started. We're going to be going over 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Has anybody got any announcements before we start? Real quick. I know the Parkers are down at the beach. My parents are in Tampa, so there's quite a few people out. But if nothing, Brother Ernie, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Our loving and gracious Heavenly Father, we come forward this morning, humble hearts, recognizing that you are the creator and sustainer, and that we live and move and have our very being without good you. Father, we thank you so much for the church here at Cottondale, for each member represented here, the opportunity we have to study together, learn from thy word, and do our best to spread it to the world as a kingdom might increase. Father, we thank you for loving us enough to send Jesus to die in our stead on that cross of Calvary. Father, this is a death that we could never pay, but we are eternally grateful that he was willing to do that for us. Father, we pray you'll be with all of our members, especially those that have been mentioned as being sick. There are some that are recovering as well. We thank you, God, for that. And we pray that you'll go with us through this service and all the coming services this morning. Bless us in thy Son's holy name. This prayer we ask. Amen.
Amen. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we're going to look at the first few verses through verse 12, 13. And this is the Old Testament example. Paul was talking to the Corinthian church there in Corinth. And he goes in, and we'll just read it. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. All right, what is Paul talking about here? The exodus of the Israelites. And he's bringing that back to an example to them. And he's putting it in a rather different way of thinking. He's actually making the Corinthians look at that in the same aspect of Christian life. He puts the baptism of Moses. Eating the spiritual fruit or food of the manna, and drinking of the water that's springing from the rock. So it's kind of putting some things back into perspective, because were all the Corinthian Christians Jews at this time? Not all of them. There were some Gentiles there as well. So, when he talks about the ancestors, he was talking about the Jewish ancestors, the Israelites themselves. Now, these things became our examples to the intent that we should not just after evil things, not lust after evil things as they do, or they also lusted, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, nor let us commit sexual immorality, or as of them did, and in one day, 23,000 fell. And I wanted to stop there because, Wednesday, if you were here, Justin was talking about, people who know the Bible really well are mainly atheist and agnostic and everything. And I wanted to focus kind of on this one verse here because it is a very popular verse for atheists or agnostic or people who don't believe in organized religion to go to show that there are quote-unquote discrepancies in the Bible. Of course, I don't believe any of us here believe that there's discrepancies, but when you look at verse 9, it says, in verse 8, it says, nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Paul was talking about the Israelites in Exodus, and he says 23,000 fell, correct? Well, if you turn to Numbers 25 and verse 9, this is where he is getting this from. And it says, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. So was Paul wrong here? One in Numbers it says 24,000 died. And in 1 Corinthians 10 it says 23,000 died. So there's 1,000 people discrepancy there. That's what a lot of atheist agnostics will go to show, hey, see, if it's the breath of God breathed out, it's inspired by God, it can't be wrong, and that shows that it's wrong.
Where in Numbers is this?
Numbers 25, verse 9.
Okay. Is this where they have, oh, wait a minute, this is,
Okay. Paul says what before he says 23,000 there? In one day. So is it possible that in one day 23,000 died and then the next day 1,000 more died?
Chances are it wouldn't be back to 23,000, 24,000.
It was an estimate.
And they do that a lot. Don't
They did that a lot, but it doesn't mean that there's any discrepancies there. If you've ever been anywhere with your spouse, wife, kids, anything, and you, like, say you go to the mall, shopping, the husband more or less is probably going to say, man, I love those cinnamon rolls that I had over there at the food court. Man, those corn dogs smell good. And, oh, there was a hunting store over here that was awesome, but most of the women are going to be like, hey, I went to Bath and Body Works, got the candles, had clothes shopping, everything. Both of them did the same trip and described different things, but does that mean the trips were different? No, it's just a different perspective. And Paul's got a different perspective of this. Paul's not saying that there was only 23,000, not the 24,000 that died. He's not being misquoted here. It's just from a different context of the thing. But that is a verse that atheists and agnostics will go to try to prove that the Bible is not inspired because there's contradictions there. But it's not really a contradictory thing because, like I said, in one day is what Paul said, and it could possibly be he was talking one day, 23,000 died, and through the whole event, 24,000 died. If we continue reading there, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. This is very popular verse for almost all denominations in the church because it's a good preaching tool of God will only tempt you so far as what you can be tested. But we can put ourselves in situations, can't we? Absolutely. The Church of Corinth here, most of this chapter is talking about fleeing from idolatry. Corinth was a city that had a lot of idol worshiping, a lot of pagan gods, a lot of meat sacrifice, a lot of sexual immorality. It was just a typical first century town of the time. A lot of people will say God will only tempt me with what I can handle, but still they'll put themselves in situations where they can be tempted by the devil. An alcoholic does not need to be going by the bar every day. That's a situation where it's not God tempting you, it's you're allowing yourself to be tempted. I've heard a story of a guy, he said, I can't help it when I drive home from work, I pass by 2 or 3 bars and I have to stop by one of them because it's just too tempting. Does God put a way of him to be able to not do that? Yeah, there's different roads he can take. He can take a different way to not have that bar in his sight. We can change our lives in that way, and God always gives you a way out. One of the most popular stories in the Bible you go through about as far as fleeing is what? Bathsheba? Joseph. That's a perfect example of fleeing from sin. No matter what happens, you need to flee from it. Okay, so we're looking at Corinth. We're looking where Paul is talking about the example of the Israelites and how they came out of the captivity of Egypt. Were those Israelites blessed by God? Absolutely. They had all the blessings in the world, but did they trust in God? Not exactly. They complained and groaned all the time to Moses about, we should have stayed in Egypt because we had food there, we had water there, and they didn't trust in God. So what did God have happen? They wandered the wilderness for how many years? 40 years. Did any of the Israelites who made it out of Egypt make it to the promised land? They all died, that generation.
Except Caleb.
Yeah, right.
Don't die.
But, it shows that even those blessed people who saw that God had blessed them can have a lack of faith at times. And I think that's what the church in Corinth was going through at the time. And Paul is trying to direct them toward the example of the Israelites and say, there are people who've been here before just like you. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless is it not the communion of blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, through many, are one bread and one body, and we partake of that one bread. Okay, let me see where my notes are. All right, no, that's not it. I'm sorry, I'm just disorganized this morning. I've got notes. All right, Paul is urging them to learn from the mistakes of their ancestors. And like I said, he's mainly talking to a Gentile church, so he made those ancestors through Christ be there. It's often noted that the behavior that is described in verse 6 through 10 are behaviors that the Corinthians struggled with. The sexual immorality, the eating and drinking of idol sacrifices, and the grumbling, the complaining that they had. We see that in verse 10. They complained and were destroyed by the destroyers. Paul realizes that the church in Corinth has a temptation to eat food, eat idol food, that the local temple and more, and it's more than just what the food represents. It is not that they are knowledgeable ones that are reluctant to give up the food. It's just because those folks are risking social standings with other people. So Paul recognizes that the idol food that has been sacrificed to idols is nothing but food. But it is different because if the Christians were to take part of it, what would other Christians view them as, is basically what he's saying, if that makes sense. So in context today, just say we're at a restaurant and they have a bar in the area and a regular seating area. Is there anything wrong with us frequenting that restaurant at any time? Most all restaurants serve alcohol. As long as we're not partaking, that should be fine. But if the only available space is at the bar right next to everybody drinking, should we do that? We shouldn't.
But if you do, because there's limited space in there, there's nothing wrong with it, as long as you do not partake.
Right. But if there were young Christian teenage from the church there, what kind of example is that setting with them? That's what you got to look at. There's nothing wrong with it explicitly.
Well, and like we said a couple of weeks ago, if you do something that will cause a brother to stumble, it's best not to do it.
Right. Right. Like an example, if we had someone here at the congregation who suffers from alcoholism as a recovering alcoholic, would it be wise of us to go sit at the bar?
No.
No. It would, like I said, you can take things that are inherently not wrong, but you put them in a different context and they can be wrong.
The temptation will always be there.
Right. Absolutely. So what Paul's talking about, he realizes that the meat that's coming from this idol worship, there's nothing wrong with it. And the church in Corinth realized there's nothing wrong with it. But in every situation, you have to look at your influence on others. You have to look at what the perception of others is going to be. And it could make it not necessarily wrong, but it could make it where it's a difficult situation. It's not easy to spread the gospel when someone's looking at you sitting at a bar. Like Brother Tony said, if that's the only available space, it's not wrong as long as you're not partaking of it. But depending on who's there, someone could view you as partaking if you, even though you're not.
Well, I think 99% of the time, we as Christians would probably wait for a table.
Right.
In the sense that, because you're supposed to shun the appearance of all these, and that would be an appearance of evil if you're sitting at a bar. Some people can assume. You cannot keep them from assuming.
Right.
But if they see you sitting there, they're just going to assume, well, they're having a drink. That may not necessarily be the case, which I hope it won't be the case.
Right. Well, it's like, when Vicky was a teacher, they had a morality clause in their contract they had to do. And, they weren't allowed to be seen in public with alcohol or anything like that. That's why most of the teachers would go out of city when they would go to drink and all. But even the perception there, sitting at a bar, if one of your students came in and saw you, it's like, ooh, going home to tell mom and daddy, my third grade teacher was at the bar. I mean, the perception there, and like I said, the temptation being there as well. And Paul goes into that. That's dining at the local temples that they had when they were doing this idol worship and sacrifice had a two-pronged approach to the Christians there as far as their temptation. They had the temptation to partake of it, and they had the temptation to say, I am powerful enough to withstand it. So it was almost like they were putting it on themselves to tempt themselves in a way. And that could be, we as human beings need to know our limitations and know that, I'm not perfect. I can be tempted. I can have all kinds of things thrown upon me, and I can sit there and think that I can withstand it, but I am just human. Stephen, what do you have?
It seems like back in Corinth, that idol worship was so firmly entrenched in their society that they would have, the amount of animals that were sacrificed to these idols meant that they would always have surplus of meat. And of course, probably most of the meat available in the meat markets and in the restaurant. I guess if they had a restaurant back then, I don't know. But if they did, most of it came from the temples. So what they're telling them is they have to be careful that they are not causing their fellow Christians to stumble, because some of them might say that might accuse them of being an idolater if they eat because there was a connection.
Right. And plus, it could be very easy. A lot of these Corinth Christians were Gentiles, and they were at one time idol worshipers. A lot of them did partake in we hear of stories of, the people who made these idols, the silver workers and everything, how profitable that was for them in Ephesus. But you can imagine that's the same thing in Corinth. So, a lot of these people did give up their livelihoods, and to go back into that world, even though they say, well, there's nothing wrong with it, the temptation to go back could be so great that it could make them stumble as well as others stumble because of that example. And as well as, they could start putting their social status higher than what the example of a Christian should be. I try to think of examples of what this could be in modern days. And it's hard to come up with some because you don't really see of sacrificial idol worshiping too much anymore. I mean, I know in other countries, in Islam, you still have goats and all that are sacrificed. I know probably about 5 or 6 years ago, the largest concentration of Muslims in the world in Bangladesh. There's millions and millions and millions of people living in the spot the size of Rhode Island. But they had a huge deluge of rain and storms come in. It was during their time of Ramadan or something, some worship would have to have sacrifices. And they showed pictures, and it was blood flowing through the streets because they had so much rain from the flooding, and they had so many sacrifices that there was so much blood in the streets that it turned the water red. And I could just imagine that. But I mean, I'm just getting off on a tangent here, but I don't really know of too many idol sacrifices that we have in the U.S. today. But examples of it would be kind of like, if a Christian repents and before becoming a Christian, I think they used to be a distiller for alcohol. You repent and say, I'm not going to produce this alcohol anymore. I'm going to find someone else. But they still go to the convention they have for distillers. It'd be kind of tempting to go back because I was profitable with it and everything else. So you got to look at the sins that we all committed prior and can continually do. Hopefully not, but it's easy to go back into that. And it's easy to go back and get tempted by that. If we put ourselves in that situation. Anybody got a comment?
And you're talking about social status.
Mm-hmm.
I think in today's society, a lot of the time it's more, let's forsake the assembly to go to a convention. Or let's forsake the assembly to go to the company golf tournament on Wednesday or Sunday evening or something like that. You're making those compromises for your social status when you've got to realize what's really important, spiritual.
Right. And if we continue reading, all to the glory of God, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions of conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. So like Paul is saying here, what we've been kind of going through, it may be lawful, it may be okay that you do it, but if you got to start thinking of, it's okay, but is it a good thing? It's just like the example we were talking about, sitting at the bar. Is it okay? Yes, but is it helpful? You can look at that on each case-by-case basis. Is it okay to play golf? Absolutely. Is it okay to play golf and forsake the assembly? No. You have to start looking at your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ as well. It may be okay that I do this, but is it edifying to them? Is it helping them be a better Christian? Is it bringing them to Christ? Is it making them feel better about themselves? So I think one of the things that I get out of this chapter a lot of is it starts making you think of the difference between the Jewish religion and Christianity. Jewish religion was a lot about law. And could anybody ever keep the law? No, the law was never meant to be kept. It's never going to be able to be kept, but you have, except Christ. But you only, in Judaism, you have laws and rules and regulations to follow. In Christianity, there are certain things you know that you have to do, but it's more about love, and it's more about doing what's best for you and your fellow Christians, and bringing people to the knowledge of Christ and the gospel. It's not a set list of rules, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. We still have our moral codes that we have to go by, but it's more than just a law. It's more than just a set of rules to follow.
Marshall, you know, about Saturday, he go play golf on Sundays during the church. His guys become a little stick about that long with the ball. Yeah,
Right.
that's his eye.
All right, and let's see. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions of conscience sakes. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but the other, for why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken for the food over which I give thanks? It's kind of a hard read to go through because of that. But this gets into that whole part I'm talking about. You know, you're doing it for other people. You're invited to someone's house. Don't ask where it came from. Just be thankful for it. And that's the way you go with it. I mean, but if you are made aware, hey, this is offered to idols, and by doing this, you're partaking in this idol worship, and everyone else knows. Yeah, I can see where you would abstain from it, but you know, your conscience will be clear if you have good intent. Because you know, if you are invited to someone's house who's not Christian, or is in a denomination or something, you could bring them to Christ. You have to always look at that. It could be something where you can influence them. Anybody else got a take on that? It's kind of a difficult read to have. You got to try to put yourself in the Corinth's mindset.
Sometimes, like if you had a Muslim friend come in, eat with you, you had pork chop, you know, I would tell him, you know, so
Right.
that would be his, you know, I mean, not that I believe he's right, but I respect
Right.
that man.
And you can do that exact opposite. You can sit there and say, you know, if I have a Muslim friend that I'm trying to convert, I'm not going to have bacon and pork chops just because I know their thought. It's same as like if you had a Jewish friend or something. Don't put that out there for them to have ammunition against you in a way. But yeah, absolutely, that could do more harm than good if you didn't. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all in the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Imitate me just as I imitate Christ. So at the end of this, whether or not it's acceptable to eat that was been sacrificed to idols, Paul will give a guiding principle. Do all to the glory of God. Like their ancestors in the faith, this predominantly Gentile Corinth church is called to live in a manner that is faithful to the one who is the very source of their life and existence. Living faithfully to this, God includes considering one's witness to others for whom Christ also died. So in this, Paul kind of gives them a way of looking at things. In all things, do for the glory of God. So if eating of meat from idol worship will glorify God, you're more than happy to do it. If you can look at it and say it's not going to glorify God, don't do it. You have to look at what your influence is going to be in all actions that you have. It's just like most everyone here knows I have tattoos. Am I getting more tattoos? No. Why? Because I look at it as influence now. What is it going to cause my children to look at me? My kids look at my tattoos all the time and talk about them. Do I want my kids to have tattoos? Not necessarily. That's their decision when they get older. But, you know, what is that influence going to cause other people to look at me? Can I bring people to Christ through my tattoos? Possibly. But
Depending upon the tattoos.
what's that?
Depending upon the tattoos.
Yeah, very, very dependent on what tattoos you have. I know I did been years ago now, the lesson on tattoos, and you know, even though they're getting more accepted in society today, it's hard to find someone my generation and younger that doesn't have a tattoo. But you know, you have examples of people with tattoos all over themselves, and they could be pretty tattoos, but could those people bring people to Christ? They can. And they can do it through that because who are they ministering to? It could be they're doing a jailhouse ministry and they see someone who looks just like them, and it could be I'm not saying go get tattoos just so you do a jailhouse ministry, but you have to start looking at your influence through things and ask yourself, does my actions give God glory? And I think that's the main theme of this 1 Corinthians chapter 10, is giving God glory in all things.
Well, you know, speaking of tattoos then, they might open conversation with somebody that wouldn't ordinarily have. And he might have an opportunity to bend that.
Right.
So you never know.
Yep, you never know.
Take the ball and run with it.
I have rambled on for long. That's 30 minutes. I rarely get 30 minutes out of Brother Tony. I'm sorry I wasn't as organized this morning. Anybody else got any other comments? Like I said, the main theme of 1 Corinthians was Paul referencing the church in Corinth back to the Israelites to kind of set that ancestry there. Most of the Jews did know the ancestry of their fathers, but the Gentiles of the group weren't actually ancestors of them, but they were through Christ. And the other thing is, all things you do, give God the glory, and do all things to the glory of God. And like I said, there's that one scripture in there where a lot of people will try to use it to show how the Bible's got discrepancies. But it doesn't. That's all I've got. Appreciate it.